Hello and welcome back to Crew Parley. This is a variant of the normal Parley on this channel. Parley, people submit a prompt and then I respond. Crew Parley is me submitting the prompt and then all of you respond. And Crew Parley is available at a lower tier so more people get to participate too. It's just available to more people. A lot of people currently have Crew Parley and aren't participating, and that's okay if you don't want to, but I just wanted you to know I would love to have you for these, and it's been fun to do them for the first few months. So here's my prompt from October, and I can say, hi, I'm Zandy. I'm not your host today. I'm the one who submitted the prompt. Here was my prompt. Many games want to leave the player a breadcrumb trail of rewards to keep them going. A lot of games also have build systems with lots of different pieces to mix and match. Hey look, a whole bunch of breadcrumb-sized rewards. Let's use those for that. And so it happened. A huge majority of games, at least in my experience, do things this way. They give the player rewards for progression that are pieces of the build system. But there's a snag. The activity of making a build involves knowing what's out there, to some extent. And some aspects of making a build, like opportunity cost, don't fire unless the build pieces that would create the opportunity cost are, well, available to the player. What do you think of this compromise? I bet many games and players and developers don't see it as a compromise. Do you? Do you have a solution where we could have our breadcrumbing and eat our builds too? A few points of clarification. So I'm pointing out here a phenomenon in gaming as a piece, a type of media in general, where almost all games that have a build system, a connection of different player options that you can mix and match to create your own playstyle, almost all games that have those things treat them as something that you breadcrumb the player, rewarding them with as they progress through the game. And I feel that there is a drawback to doing that that is very, very rarely seemingly acknowledged, like that I feel like people just don't think about, or most games don't do anything about. And that drawback is that a lot of aspects of enjoying making a build, using the build system as an end in itself, you like making builds, not just this side thing that's there while you complete the rest of the game. A lot of activities where you enjoy the build system itself involve not getting the build system pieces that way, in this breadcrumby fashion. If you don't have lots of other options, then opportunity cost, there being some reason that you want to be careful how much space in your build you use, well, that doesn't work if you don't have other things that would be good for your build that could be in those slots. And likewise, if you are trying to make a build with some kind of enabler or strategy, you may not have or not even know if there is existing enablers for that strategy. You want to make a type of build, but you simply don't know how much of that kind of thing, that type of stuff that would fit in your build. You want to make a fire themed build, I don't know, and you don't know how many items that enable fire damage there are in the game. And you can look them up, but then like you don't have them, and you may or may not be able to specifically go get them. And I don't think that this means that all games should never reward build items as breadcrumbs, obviously. That makes perfect sense for plenty of games. But I do think there are a lot of games that are trying to make their build system enjoyable in itself. They're primarily focused on their build system. They want the player to participate in build systeming, but you essentially can't. Like, you really can't do that, because the activities that make the build system work inherently require you to have most of the game's build options, which you simply don't while you're playing it. Like, you do play most of the game without those options, and then afterward a different game that is about builds just kind of happens afterward. And there is maybe not as much of a feeling of progression in that game as well, since you've completed most of the preceding game's content already. And I think this is a tension that is worth solving sometimes. I think there are lots of games that are really just not about that. They want their build offering to be light and something that you can enjoy as a way to kind of shift your experience a little while enjoying the main game. And I think in those games it makes a lot of sense to upgrade your build options as you progress. Like, that's fine. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. But there are just many games where I don't think it's as fine. I think the game is trying to make making builds fun, but does this kind of classic thing of providing build rewards this way instead of something that more thoughtfully fits the game's design goals for that specific game, and thus, maybe without realizing it, kind of hamstrings a lot of the ability to make fun builds. That's what I think. This is an extremely overcomplicated parlay question, so forgive me for explaining it like twice as much after reading it. But it's my parlay, so I get to do what I want. And indeed, in there are only 2 responses this month, and they're long, and I want to just give the benefit of the doubt really quick before we start. I definitely could have explained this better, and it's a complicated subject. I can relate to this when I do parlay with all of you. Sometimes there's a part in the parlay and I go, like I feel like there's more to that idea, and I'm gonna have to do my best to figure it out. And you all did your best to figure out what the hell I meant. So I just wanted to say thank you. That's great. Let's read the responses now. I have a lot to say about these responses. But again, just to summarize, basically what I am frustrated about here is the idea that games are basically just every single game does it this way without thinking about what it does to do it this way. And for many kinds of games, that's fine, but there are a lot of types of games where I contend that it's actually fairly bad for the game overall. And it's not so much that the game like particularly needs to do it, they just all do by default. Obviously not every single game does things that way, but you get what I mean. A lot of games provide rewards this way, in my opinion, without really noticing that there are actually pretty severe consequences for the game's build system, while simultaneously many of those games are quite focused on their build system, and so I would contend that it is worth finding a better solution in those cases. Okay. True Parlay Grandmaster Food, what you got? Step up to the plate. I got a big old question. There's no possible answers. Hit me with your best shot. No, I'm sure we can figure it out. Mr. Fruit begins. I'm not sure if I have a good answer here, but I do have a mindset that applies here. Even better. Great. Awesome. I sometimes like to think of build pieces as treasure chests and keys. Okay, cool. You want to get the treasure, which is the gameplay experience that you want, but you somehow need a way to unlock its potential. Finding the right keys to unlock its potential is the process of making a build. Interesting, okay? I will provide some examples. You might view the weapon aspects in Hades as the treasures. They would define your experience. They can be what defines your experience. Okay, that'll work as an example. And you need to find a way to unlock their potential via boons, mirror of night options, etc. For example, you might have a treasure, the aspect of Chiron bow. So this, when you hit an enemy with your attack, your special, which is a fan of arrows, they all home in on the target you attacked. This allows you to hit with your special many, many, many times very rapidly with perfect accuracy. And then the key could be Sea Storm, a Zeus Poseidon duo boon that causes knocking back enemies to trigger a lightning strike. I forget exactly because it's been a while since I played Hades 1. But it does very good single spike damage. It doesn't multiply the damage of the hit. It does a single instance of damage that has a set medium value. So it does a huge amount of damage if you hit a lot of times rapidly. And this enables you to do that. Yep. Note that there might be multiple keys to any given treasure. Of course, and there are other things in Hades 1 that do a single medium-sized packet of damage, and so you want to hit a bunch of times in a row. Absolutely. Just Zeus's special boon would be like good, not as good, but good. The idea with Sea Storm is that you have to apply like the knockback and the lightning. You want both hitting, and so I forget exactly how it works, honestly, because Sea Storm has been such a meme for so long. But the point is, yes, it uniquely enables that. You see that there's a potential treasure, you get this really powerful ability to make your special home in and hit a bunch of times, and then you have to find something that unlocks the potential of that treasure that benefits you if you hit the enemy a bunch of times in a row really reliably, possibly also right after hitting them with your attack. And then that kind of unlocks it a little bit. Sure, I don't know if I would describe this as the process of making a build, but this is definitely a very common pattern of thought when you make builds. Totally cool. Okay, I'm with you. Let's keep going. What exactly the treasure is, Mr. Fu continues, might be interchangeable. In Remnant 2, there is the Canine Keepsake Amulet and the Ring of the Damned, 2 items that provide massive stat bonuses if you manage to get to 50% of your life as gray health. This is the health that you retain when you take damage, and then if you can like maybe heal it back in some ways, but if you get hit again, it goes away. But how do you achieve that? How do you get 50% of your health to be gray health? And once you do, how do you survive because you've lost it all? One set of keys I found are the Paper Heart Relic, the Ring of Omens, and the Warden class. The first converts all health to gray health. The second converts any gray health you manage to regenerate on dodge while giving you Misty Step. Misty Step allows you to wear heavy armor to get the most out of the shields that the Warden class provides, because heavy armor gives you more damage reduction for those shields. So the idea here in this Remnant example is that you make all your health into gray health, very dangerous because you don't have that health. It's just health you could recover if you do it quick enough before getting hit again. Paper Heart, your health is gone. You've got no health. You die to anything. But you've got 50% gray health. Good job. You know, you get those bonuses. But now we have to find a way to keep it. So Ring of Omens, this lets you dodge in a way that avoids the demerit of having heavy armor. You get the Misty Step dodge. You just kind of float as a mist. And then because you have a lot of armor, you can give a lot of damage reduction to shields, which are a type of health you can have over your health, which is gone now and is gray health. And so you can survive doing it that way. Right. Pretty cool. So this is a sort of treasure and key example as well. Smart developers, Mr. Fruit concludes, are aware of the treasure key structure. The Ring of Omens only gives you the Misty Step if you wear an amulet associated with a Yaishin deity because of the lore. And guess what? The canine keepsake from before, the payoff for having all gray health, is associated with the Ravager, so it works. Right. Pretty cool. Yeah, I wanted to quickly add a note that smart developers being aware of the treasure key structure in a build system may not use that knowledge to enable it. They might use that knowledge to slightly disable a potential synergy. I believe the best approach is going to be to create the amount of opportunity cost or the amount of enabling that makes for interesting decisions. That will not always be to help the player. That might be they notice that it's really fun to pull off this combo of items, but they make it a little harder because it's a little too easy by default. And then they make it so like it's a bit more punishing. You know, it takes a little more space in your build, or you know, one of the items is maybe a little awkward. It enables it, but it's not that strong generally, something like that. Smart developers being aware of the treasure key structure may or may not mean that they actually help you get to those treasures and keys. They might, you know, modify it up or down in terms of ease to achieve it, to make it more interesting. Yes, all very sensible points. Okay. Mr. Fruit continues, the difficulty of game design for Buildcraft is to decide what you make unlockable versus what is available easily. Sure, that's definitely one of those difficulties. Personally, Mr. Fruit says, I love unlocking a treasure from that example before. It gives me something to think about while I'm looking for a key for that treasure. Sure, you get a build piece that begs the question, and then when you get other build pieces, you go, like, could this fit very well? Sure. And a really interesting idea that we're going to get back to in a minute is the idea of determining what kinds of build pieces make for better unlocks. And personally, I would contend that it is perhaps keys rather than treasures. Maybe if you give players treasures by default or earlier in the game, and then you give them keys later on, there's a sort of cause and effect that makes it advantageous to give that loot in a certain order. Some of you may be familiar with my significant excitement, let's not call it an obsession, that's rude, with unlock all as a concept, the idea that you simply unlock all the build stuff right away, because I think a lot of games do have some significant downsides because they provide rewards as breadcrumbs like this, and that holds their build system hostage. That's the whole premise of the question. And a very simple solution, not often an ideal one, but a simple solution, is to just let the player have all of it. And if they have enthusiasm for making builds anyway, you at least fixed the build system in a very crude way, and you can enjoy the game with the build system online. Yes, it has its drawbacks, but it's something. And another potential solution is to open up the idea that simply reordering or rearranging the way you get the unlocks could have an outsized benefit for how fun the game will feel. If you just give players unlocks in a different order. It's actually very similar to a previous parlay from Lord Rusty, where we were talking about what parts of a game's build system you give the player in a demo or at the beginning of the game. And in fact, iPatch Notes also had there's been a lot of talk about this lately, another video idea for talking about what build pieces you start the player with, whether it's one choice and what that choice is if it's only one, or if you give them multiple potential starting points they can choose between. Just things like that can have a huge benefit here, absolutely. Of course, the ideal solution too would be that developers don't even need to develop any more stuff or any more systems, and they could just move around the pieces they have and make things better. You can certainly make the situation better by doing that, yeah. I think that's a great idea. And the idea that thinking about it as treasures and keys illustrates the sort of causal way you might think about builds, and then you could use that to your advantage to make a game's unlock order better for facilitating players making builds is a really good idea. That's super smart. Yeah, but see, this is an easy problem to solve. Let's continue. Less patient players, Mr. Food says, might be frustrated with such a structure because they want to use the shiny new thing. They got a treasure and they really want to get a key for it, but they don't have one yet. Right, so there could be drawbacks, it's true. I think if the player can be working toward the key they want, then that's okay. I will get back later to the idea of like interlocking motivations, though. Unlocking keys too early can lead a player to deciding that an item is useless and forgetting about it long before they ever find what treasure it could have been used on. And problematically, the game may just be poorly balanced. Some keys may end up being dead ends, and some treasures might not be so great after all. But if you unlock things too quickly, you will have trouble wrapping your head around every build piece, leading you to getting burned out on the buildcraft aspect. This part I take a little contention with. I take it that you're making this point as a way to illustrate that while there are downsides to the treasure and key breadcrumbing structure, in other words, you keep the breadcrumbing, but you carefully order them in terms of treasures and keys, like you're suggesting. It seems like this endpoint you're trying to make is that while that has its downsides, unlocking everything from the starter too quickly, like making players wait, has its problems, but not making players wait also has its problems, and therefore it's still worth considering. Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I definitely don't agree at all on at the surface level that if you unlock things too quickly, you'll have trouble wrapping your mind around every build piece, leading you to get burned out on the buildcraft aspect. That's just some people's experience. Like, there's plenty of other people who that would make them want to make tons of builds. I'm definitely speaking from personal experience, but neither I nor anyone who feels that way are alone. There's plenty of people who'd feel both ways. Sure. I would agree with you that I think finding like a sweet spot is often a good solution. I'm not necessarily suggesting, I'm not trying to beg the question with this parlay that you just need to find a way to do unlock all for every game where this is a conflict. Not at all. I think there are many ways to do it. And I agree with you that simply pacing, can do a lot of good here, potentially. Now, you suggest something else as well. The solution I suggest is an unsatisfying one and something I've said before. Games should have as little build pieces as possible so the player can unlock them quickly without being overwhelmed. Also, allowing players to preview the effects of items while targeting specific unlocks can be a great way to get the gears turning without necessarily overwhelming the player. This was a bit of a 180 for me. I was slightly confused by the beginning of this. I feel like you just suggested not doing this, almost. Let's break it down slightly, because there's two more suggestions here. This is not only not one solution, it's also one or two more solutions. You've already presented, I think, an interesting solution. Okay, so the first part is games should contain as little build pieces as possible, as few build pieces as possible, so the player can unlock them quickly without being overwhelmed. So I take it that this is an extension of the idea earlier, where the breadcrumbing, it's either like you're going to take too long between pieces and then you're impatient, you get a treasure, you know you need a key for it to be any good, but you're gonna have to wait a while for that. And also the game just ending or being poorly balanced in the end, and then you don't, like, get to enjoy the pieces. The player unlocking things quickly might mean they get overwhelmed and then they don't experience those things. There's all these pitfalls. And so if you let the player unlock things fairly quickly, they don't get impatient between treasures and keys, but then there's also not that many build pieces, they don't get overwhelmed by a lot of options, then maybe that's a good solution. I don't think it's a terrible solution. Now, I think it also solves a problem we're going to get to later in iPatch Notes' response about how the game can often end before you get to use your build. One of my many criticisms of games breadcrumbing build pieces like this is that it often leads to a situation where the build system is a big part of the game, but it doesn't actually do much until the game is almost over. And there are a lot of games where you unlock some sweet new weapon and you have like one mission to use it before the game is you've concluded the game's content. I think this is fairly almost unarguably bad. Like the game gives you something cool and you barely ever get to use it. There are cases where it works well. You get a kind of last hurrah or a temporary power up at the end for some story beat related reason, and it can feel really good. It can work, sure. But I think in a lot of cases, especially if it's going to be a player choice, the player has to build something with this new piece. I think you fairly clearly need to give them time to do that, or it's kind of pointless. There at least needs to be a plan for what the player will do with the game's build systems once they're done. For me, a really bad example of this, or a good example, but it's not a positive thing, is in Transistor, where there's a really interesting system if you continue leveling in Transistor. Transistor has this thing where when you get an upgrade, you get a build piece. It's like a function. They're called functions, and they can be either an attack or an upgrade to a function. Once you level up enough, you get all the functions and you begin to be able to get them again, which lets you use them as their own upgrade for themselves, or use them as an attack with other upgrades while also using them as an upgrade for a different attack, and so on. The game gains a lot of potential build complexity and really opens up, in my opinion, long after it is over. It's a very story-based, very linear game that presents, in my opinion, practically no reason to sort of go again. There is a sort of basic New Game Plus system, but it's quite regular, and therefore the game is basically over before the best aspect of its build system comes online. And for this game, there isn't a clear solution because you already unlock things at like probably the slowest possible pace. Whenever there's a story beat or most fights, you're unlocking a new function. And so slowing it down or reducing the number of upgrades would just make things even worse. Like you can't speed it up very much either. If you sped it up, you would be getting upgrades like more than once per any event occurring, which like I would argue that's maybe too much. Literally anything you do, any fight or any story beat, you get multiple upgrades feels like maybe a bit too much. But I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to see what that would be like. And you could try to reduce the functions. Certainly, a strength of Supergiant as a developer is that they're often pretty reserved with the number of options they put in. They make them dense options. That's definitely something Transistor does well, in my opinion, their upgrades and abilities. So it would be very difficult to do any of the things we've talked about for Transistor. Transistor is an example where you kind of need more game for us to enact any of these solutions. But then I would say, yeah, you can see how this stuff would help. That's not really a critique of these solutions, just to point out that there are a good number of games where there's a kind of indirect reason why you can't do these things. It might be that the game doesn't have enough like space content for you to pace upgrades in this way and have it kind of work. Again, in these games, I would propose that we're in a world of looking for better solutions, because an okay solution would be to just unlock everything right away or make the unlocks fast, and simply let the players sort of introduce themselves to them more slowly somehow. Like you only get so many ability slots right away or something like that. You can change how the player weaves in new unlocks they have, rather than having it be that they unlock new abilities themselves. They have all the abilities unlocked, but they unlock another slot for abilities. Could potentially be a way to kind of meter complexity and say, well, look, you don't have to look at every upgrade. You can't even fit most of them anyway. Wait till you get your next slot. So I hope that you're willing to at least keep an open mind to maybe that could work well. It's not inherently true that it will overwhelm like most players. There could be a way around that. Hardly any games do this, so just not to be blunt, but like we at the very least just don't know if players would not like that or not. We would have to see more games that did it to see how they'd feel. But I really like the preview effects comment. I think that this really powerfully informs the thing that you're describing. First of all, the player can simply check if a key will enable a treasure that they're excited about. And then seeing that little preview in the test room or the firing range, they get to try out, all the game's build items. And then they know, I don't know, there's an old man in the corner that says, I've heard tale of a mystical ring that will enable that bauble you've hung around your neck and make you do big bongo damage, Yugi boy. And then you like go out and find it and you're excited because you know it will be the thing you want. You're not sort of cheaped out of your excitement. But you still have to go get it. And maybe you're a little more patient too because it'll be worth it or whatever. I like this idea. I think the steadily increasing prevalence of having a testing room in these games with build systems, we're getting closer. Now give us the ability to test out other build options in the testing room, and we're cooking with gas. Yeah, I don't know. I like this response. I think there's a lot of good in the idea to meter out upgrades in a different way. I wanted to talk about something that I think adds to this concept, though it does clash a little bit with minimizing game pieces, build pieces. I don't really want to strictly minimize build pieces, personally, so I don't see that as a huge flaw, but there are some problems. There's something I wanted to add. So you've got your treasure, and then you're looking for a key. And we've done the thing Mr. Fruit suggested, where you kind of balance the unlocks in the game, such as you progress through the game, you're getting treasures before keys, and then looking for or eagerly awaiting getting the key that will unlock the treasure. Cool, so we've done that. Now, I think ideally, the treasure and the key, in a lot of the examples that we used, it was like one treasure, one key. But of course, in a lot of builds, there will be a few moving parts. And I think a really effective thing you can do when you structure unlocks in these ways is to make it so you get a treasure, and before you get the key to that treasure, you get another treasure. Then you get the key for the first treasure. Then you get, on your way to the key for the second treasure, a third treasure. And then it keeps going like this. So you're always in the middle of waiting for, like, the next thing, basically. You're always making a build using a complete interlocking synergy, always able to use aspects of the game's build systems. But you're also always on your way to getting another one. Now, this helps address one of my concerns with the subject, which is that things like opportunity cost may not fire, or you won't have a complete synergy. You're focusing on the complete little synergies, and then if it's like two items hooking up together, let's say it's literally two, one treasure, one key, well, that's not very many slots of opportunity cost, which means you may be able to achieve opportunity cost earlier. There are some games that do something like this in a kind of incomplete way. There's this weird thing in Baldur's Gate 3 where you have gear. So you're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, basically, but in a computer game. And so they give you a lot of magic items. Your dungeon master doesn't have to keep track of them, so just give players a ton of items that have a crap ton of text on them. I don't know. These are the people that make Magic the license is owned by the people who make Magic the Gathering. So, come on. Larian Studios was probably like, yeah, just take the average Magic card, write down the number of words on it, and put that much text on every player item. So they're dense items that can enable interlocking synergies. Now, some slots on your character's, set of equipment don't get filled very early, though. They're probably going to have their hands full of weapons or a shield, get a shield pretty early. But weirdly, cloaks. There are like no cloaks in the game until Act 3. There are like late in Act 2 where there start being more of them. And in a way, that's kind of good, right? If there were only if they took the same number of cloaks and they spread them out through the whole game, then early game you would find one cloak and you'd put on that cloak. And there's not that much of a point to that decision because it's not a decision. You have no other cloaks. It's fine. You get an upgrade, whatever. But if there's going to be a lot of cloaks and you're meant to choose which cloak you want, then that's not happening yet, for a very, very long time. This is something you could debate. Whole separate parlay would be like, do you even want it to be that you have opportunity cost on sooner? But I would argue if the game is going to go on to be about that opportunity cost, it is beneficial to consider getting it online. The way the game is set up now, because the cloaks are concentrated at the end of Act 2 and Act 3, you don't spend very long having a cloak where you don't have more cloaks, which means you have the opportunity cost on earlier. If you extended this further to more slots in the game's equipment and made it so you've only really got a shirt and pants and boots, I don't know, gloves and weapons, and then later in the game you start getting rings, jewelry, and then later in the game you start getting helmets and cloaks, then it could be that your treasure and key structure is augmented by this kind of chain of treasure and key relationship structure. You get only a limited number of slots early on, and so there's opportunity costs established quite quickly. You get 3 or 4 different breastplates or whatever, and some of them are treasures or keys for various other armor items, but usually gloves, pants, boots, weapons. And so that's a little microcosm, and they usually only cross over like that. Then, while you're on your way to getting most of the keys for that little microcosm, you also start getting rings, and most rings could be treasure key relationship items with other rings, or the items you already have. This creates a situation where you're on your way to finishing your treasure and key stuff with your main armor and weapons, while just beginning your treasure and key stuff with your rings. That opportunity cost is coming online. And then you move on to the cloak thing, and you get it. You could have something late game like cloaks, which are, it's only one item, so it's going to be hard for it to be treasure and key with just one item slot, but they might be treasures or keys that relate to the other item slots you have so far. And by balancing the way that the game gives you loot like this, you could imagine that although it would be rather contrived from a fashion sense, I guess poor people just can't have cloaks for traveling. That's, but okay. The build system would kind of come online in a coherent way. This is just meant to be an example of how you can use just intelligently ordering the breadcrumbing of rewards to largely undo this problem. You don't have to like not use build rewards as the breadcrumbs. Again, for many developers, this just feels like too big an opportunity to pass up. Like they have no other breadcrumbs to give you but the build system pieces. So they're not going to not do that. This is meant to illustrate, well, you don't have to. You can still do much better, I would argue much better, by structuring it differently. Very, very cool response. I felt like there was a lot in here. Mr. Food, I hope I managed to get all of it. And I thought you had pretty good ideas. Again, I'm a little confused by the way you concluded. While I don't think you need to have as few build pieces as possible. I feel like I see the benefits. I think I get why you're saying that. But you offered quite a few solutions of various kinds. Well done. I guess thanks. You answered my question. For the most part. It's not a totally complete answer, of course, but it's definitely usable. You can work from there. I feel a little vindicated too, right? It's like point made. You definitely can improve the situation without doing anything like that crazy. You don't need to just make it unlock all. This question was not meant to be facetious, and I just like proved that everything should be unlock all. I don't think that. There are games where it could work well. I think there are a lot of games where you don't unlock a lot or most or all of the stuff early, and there isn't really a thoughtful reason why not. But there are a lot of games where there is a clear need to have some kind of reward. So it makes sense why the game doesn't do that. The game just doesn't have a good way to do that, given the situation. So, okay. Now on to something a little bit different. There is the further problem of games giving you all this stuff. This structure happens, but then while you're doing this crazy daisy chain thing, you kind of don't get to the end point of your build before the game is sort of over. Eye Patch Notes begins. There's a certain almost dreadful feeling when nearing the end of a game. Universal or specific to some, who knows. In my case, my motivation is directly correlated to how many unknowns are left. Sometimes this is explicit, an X% completed on a save file, or purely intellectual. Have I tried X or Y thing yet? Now my motivation will seldom drop to true zero, but I will absolutely put off the very definite final boss climax, trademark, to avoid tempting fate. Library of Ruina is the most explicit case in recent memory, since Limbus Company was announced shortly after I completed it. The gacha-inspired true sequel meant that Library had fully and truly shuttered its doors. As expected, most of my drive to play dried up once the true ending played out. There were some last minute toys gated behind the true ending, but they primarily served to make watching the true ending easier. After all, the player has witnessed the true ending. What could lay beyond near 100% completion? The answer is technically mods. Not a direction I expected this to go in. Cool. I can distantly appreciate mod support as developers large and small go out of their way for Steam Workshop integration. However, the creative hands have changed, and I cannot trust that the mechanical narrative I fell in love with will be present in community creations. Certainly, you could argue it's something kind of different. There's a lot to say here. I think like 2 or 3 topics. First one is about the idea of the build system not coming online until the game is about to end. A classic issue. And Mr. Food's suggestion is useful here in some ways. If you reduce the build pieces or you reduce the amount of time that you're doing this breadcrumb training thing, then potentially, things can work out. Though it's not a pure solution because if the game wants to motivate the player with unlocks anyway, well, having them run out before the end doesn't really work. This is another place where I think you can see that the idea of using the build system as breadcrumbs is just ill-considered in a way. There's an inherent conflict between breadcrumbing the player with a reward that is only useful if you have time to use it to make a build and then play with that playstyle afterward, and the breadcrumbs that are the rewards for progression are those things which you inherently need to have time to use. It's just fairly obviously that means you're going to be breadcrumbing the player right up until the final hour with these things that require more than the final hour to enjoy. This just inherently isn't a very good match. Build options are like the first thing you think of when you want breadcrumb rewards, but I think like many first things one thinks of, I don't know, maybe I'm more down on them than most people. They're just clearly not that good of a fit for that purpose. And nowhere is that more true than the end of the game. And although we have some solutions for what to do for the majority of the game's length from Mr. Food's section to maybe make breadcrumbing with build pieces work better where it makes sense or where we're going to do it, or games that feel like they have to do it, it still doesn't address that much the end of the game experience, where I feel like many of these problems come to a head. So, first of all, I think there's the element of games kind of having build systems when they are a linear experience that I feel like is sort of one of the cores of the issue. Having a game that has all these options but definitively ends, it sort of is what creates that conflict. If you make a game that is a linear story, it proceeds and ends, and you don't structure the game in a way where it's meant to be fun to kind of like mess about in the environment. I don't know if Library of Ruina is like that. Then I think there is a conflict there. Like, I'm not sure build systems in general are that good of a fit for a game that, is just going to end. Now, earlier I talked about there are lots of games that will offer you build options, but it's like a light offering. It's just meant to be you tweak the game's experience a bit to your taste, but it's not the focus. It's a lightweight build system. I think something that happens really often is the games that don't intend their build system to be a focus just like make it pretty cool, like put a good amount of work into it, and the result is that it does kind of scope creep into being something that the player will get excited about. But then the design hasn't really planned for that because it wasn't originally intended to be this thing with larger scope. And then we end up with these games that have these cool build systems. And on the surface, it's like, well, why is it worse for the build system to be better, more? But it is in a way because the game sort of baits you into being excited to play with that a lot, but then isn't structured in a way where you will get to kind of come to the complete form of your build at the end. I'd also like to say that I think the way we make builds is partly to blame. I'm going to use Baldur's Gate 3 again as an example, and really many tabletop role-playing games. Well, ideally, it's about the journey, not the destination. And that could mean a few things for making builds. It might be that you enjoy different breakpoints on your build. Something that is often really interesting in tabletop role-playing games is setting up your build, your multi-class setup, for example, in Pathfinder or Dungeons and Dragons, in such a way that you live through the middle levels until a certain breakpoint where the build is kind of online in some way. This is really popular in these communities if you go around looking at people's character builds. you'll see them say, you know, online by level 4 or online by level 7 or like by level 6 you can do this, that, and the other thing. You get more good stuff relevant to the build for the, you know, rest of the levels or whatever. But who knows exactly when the campaign is going to begin and end, and so here is the build's kind of breakpoint. A very, very cool way to talk about builds, just by the way, like that's awesome. Love that. And it's pretty interesting when playing through Baldur's Gate 3, a game where you can spend a good amount of time at the end of the leveling curve, 12, lower than, you know, D&D 5th edition. And also it's a video game, so you know you could get to the max level. You know what I mean? The campaign isn't going to end, your playgroup isn't going to break up like before you get to level 12. You know the game will get to level 12 because it's a video game that was already made. And so that does kind of change things with making builds somewhat. My point was that in a lot of games, though, it's much easier to think about a build as you fill every slot. You know, you have used every piece of whatever, the whole build is there, and then the kind of journey to figuring out the build, optimizing for those spaces, begins. That was what I was kind of suggesting, where some aspects of making a build, like opportunity cost of a kind, don't fire unless the build pieces that would create that opportunity cost are available to the player. There's the journey of a build where you play many versions of the build as it like fills up all the slots, and that can be interesting in some games. But then there's also the journey of you have the complete build and the journey begins there. And now you start refining from those spaces. And exactly what makes the game satisfying one way or another is, I guess, going to have to be something we explore in the future, because that's interesting, right? But I think that that has to do with this. There are many systems that I feel like they're stretching. You know, they want to fill the space in the game with the options they have. And the result is that they are systems designed to be interesting only when complete, but you never experience them when they are complete. They're not systems designed to be a moving target that's really fun. But if they were, maybe suddenly this breadcrumbing thing would be a lot better, would feel a lot better. And it would be fun to complete the game and go again, perhaps. Definitely something that's worked for me with Remnant 2, for example, is that it fills your build slots incredibly quickly, like quicker than almost any game with such a build system I've played. And the result is that you begin the journey of refining the build. You have the opportunity cost online almost immediately. There's almost zero time between starting the game and that feeling, which really helps it feel like you spend a lot of time with a complete build, maybe not the build you would ideally have wanted. Or, you know, you have a rather low percentage of the total items in the game, but you still feel like you're doing meaningful build crafting. And then because the story is kind of not a story and is just sort of a gauntlet of challenges, you may enjoy running through it again on a higher difficulty and just like the journey continues. This can work very, very well, I think. The move of doing the remnant thing, letting the player unlock a lot of build pieces really quickly and fill their limited opportunity costs, their limited slots very quickly, I think is a big move that could work for many games. Just make it be that the player has a little less of a breadcrumb trail. Sacrifice just a little bit of it to get the player with a full build system online from the start, even if it's a really, really messy build that they have. Now they've begun the journey of unlocking upgrades and opportunity costs for that build system right away. So if you were to design a game that wanted to breadcrumb its build options, but the build system is good at its best, designed for you having all of your build slots filled, simply front-loading a little quick machine gun of build options could be enough to fix it, or make it feel a lot more fun in any case. Or you could explore the idea of figuring out what makes a build system feel more like it's fun at various breakpoints. Again, I don't have as much more to say about that. I wish I did, but I think that's pretty interesting. Now, the next thing is sort of mods, or what lies beyond a little bit. Yeah, eye patch notes. I feel like a concern I've always had with modded content, rather than just like modifying the game's mechanics somewhat, is that making a build can significantly involve knowing what the content is. what sort the content will be. And therefore, like when you say, I cannot trust that the mechanical narrative I fell in love with will be present in the community creations. Yeah, exactly. They might be more of the game, but that doesn't mean that they're going to reward the same build making thinking, the same strategizing in general. It doesn't even have to be a build system thing as the rest of the game did. That would be quite challenging. No offense, modding people. And you don't even need that. It could be fun for a lot of people for the modded content to be like of a different kind, using the game's systems, but it's like something different. However, it definitely doesn't seem to me that it solves the problem of the game, the original game ending. It just means if you want to keep speaking the language of the game's systems, you can continue doing that in some other content, but it will be like reapplying that language to something new and different. Now, don't get me wrong. I suppose in theory, you could have a mod that very, very effectively emulated the rest of the game experience. And then maybe that could feel like you were continuing to play through the same game, speak in the same language. Your build can now be used after the game proper is over because there's a further part of the game added by the community that sticks to the same design but doesn't breadcrumb any more build options. It's there if you want something to use your build for. I would just quickly like to point out here that I think a lot of people, Mr. Food, I kind of felt like I was feeling this from you, but I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth. I feel like a lot of people underestimate how much people want to just play their build, like use builds and play them. I think that people a little bit baby the potential audience with unlocks and upgrades. You don't have to make people addicted to something for them to enjoy playing it. It is okay to have a part of the game where you do not offer the player any specific reward and they just want to play the cool system you made. They have a build idea, you gave them that build idea, and then having there be content to play that build with is almost in itself a reward. You don't have to make everything have these little breadcrumbs. That just isn't necessary. All over the place, you'll see people enthusiastic for stuff like this. I'm not saying that it's worthless to provide the player rewards, but I think it's short-sighted to act like you need to always be focused on what kind of material reward, what kind of Pavlovian addiction you're giving the player. You don't, I think fairly clearly don't. I'm not saying anyone is explicitly saying that, but I do feel that vibe sometimes when the topic of more game comes up. If you've done a good job, ideally, all you have to do is give us more. That being said, having there be some purpose to, the content is still there. And that can be really elusive. Like if you're playing some new modded thing, the reward is that you wanted more game. And so now it's a reward for there to be additional content. Sort of. I guess you could think of it that way. So it's tricky with mods. Of course, the way I've usually approached the subject is to mod the build system, to adjust it to be less problematically in the way or broken by the game's structure. But of course, you could mod the game's structure to be less in the way of the build system, in theory. I just want to point out how much harder that would usually be. If in a given game, you have basically two options. You could use mods to adjust the pace of the build system, give yourself experience more, unlock everything right away, get unlocks in a different order, etc. You could make mods like that, players could download mods like that. Or you could make a mod that adds an entire new chunk of content to the game, doesn't do anything to the build system, thus creating a kind of ramp at the end where you can enjoy the full system. Think about how much harder it is to make that than to just change some numbers about how quickly you acquire the build options. You know what I mean? And so from a modding perspective, I would argue while it does change the core game rather than just adding to it, which I happen to know iPatch Notes is somewhat opposed to, it's just orders of magnitude easier, so much easier. It goes from being maybe impossible, you're not going to find someone who will be able to make that amount of additional whole game out of the existing game. It goes from a little bit impossible to being extremely possible, almost easy by comparison. And so that is a place where I think modifying the build system that's there is not a terrible idea. Maybe there's certainly a big merit, and then you might have your own quibbles with doing that. Still a very interesting suggestion, and I do feel like the the idea of, you completed the ending of the game and then what's left, builds, but you've got to have somewhere to use them, is a definite conflict for a lot of games. A lot of games will offer something like I mentioned in Transistor before. You've got your different functions, and if you keep leveling, you get duplicates of them. Well, here's a new game plus option. Player, we'll let the enemies keep scaling and let you loop the game if you really badly want to keep playing. I definitely respect the move to put that in. They thought, well, it would take us very little development time, relatively very little development time, to mod in the ability to just keep going. We could just make the enemy levels keep scaling, make a basically effective scaling curve, and let the player keep going if they want to. For so little development time, we could give the player that option if they want it. Credit where credit's due, sure, that's cool. It's a nice gesture. I think for me, the problem with Transistor and some games that do this is that there's not quite enough there to play through it again. You play through the exact same linear, story segment again, not necessarily streamlined for the parts of the story that you possibly just played through. The game isn't that long. And so that hasn't worked that well for me. Now, Remnant 2, on the other hand, same situation, but I've played through 3 or 4 times. What's up with that? Well, there's tons of side content. Things don't happen in the same order. You're not bogged down by huge amounts of story, stuff like that. I think that can make a big difference. So, just as a shout out, I think it's great when games offer, like, keep going with the same model or settings you had. We just added scaling for you, and you can keep going if you want. That's really great. If you do just a little bit more, it could be so much more. Just streamlining like cutscenes and repetitive stuff we've already seen, just making it be a little bit different. Like even if it's like some of the bosses, or there are new mini bosses that are just a giant version of an enemy that's already in the game. That could go a long way potentially. I'm not sure it would have been a great fit for Transistor, sure. What do you say? And you can't just put a ton of side content in like Remnant 2 does, no. But even things like shuffling the order things happen in and stuff like that, I don't know, like there's a lot there in a lot of these games. You could make it really fun to continue using your build you made for a little longer. I do have a kind of other version of a recommendation though. I definitely think that for me, one of the biggest things that lies beyond near 100% completion is discovering the existence of a new build concept from a community member in a game that I've played. Somebody recommends, hey, you could do this with this upgrade, and I go, I want to try that, and I go to my 100% completed, version of the game and give it a shot, and I have a good time for an afternoon. That can be a lot of fun. I think the idea of seeing a build possibility in a game that you've already mostly completed can be fun if there's a place to use it, if there's a coherent way to utilize that. So just as an aside, that's something that's been on my mind a lot because it's benefited me a lot with all of you waking back up to games and build systems because I thought of or somebody else thought of and told me about like a new way to use the systems I'd already played with. That's been fun for me in the past. Cool. Well done. That was a pretty timely one for Crew Parley. This is short because we only have 2 responses, but they were very good responses. So I hope you enjoyed hearing what I had to say, responding to your responses. And thank you. I thought we got a kind of good answers, some actionable answers. These are very satisfying. I don't mean to brag, but these are often very like, I have a plan in mind for what to do with the answer already questions. And so when you all have really good thoughts, it's going to feel fulfilling because I already have it in mind how I would apply a solution if I had one. I just don't fully have one yet. And so if we form one together, this is very exciting. I really enjoyed these. So thank you. It was really a lot of fun. And thank you for your supporting the stuff that I make on these many channels. Folks, a lot of you watching have Crew Parley, have access to this. So if you'd like to submit something for this month's prompt, I would really love to have you. If you need help finding any of that, just send me a message on Discord and I'll help you set it up. You basically just need to connect your Discord account and whatever account if it's Twitch and you're a Twitch Prime sub, you just have to connect Twitch and Discord. If it's Patreon, you just have to connect Patreon and Discord. And if you want to get this, it's $5 a month to support me at this tier, and then as a little perk, I would love to have you as part of Crew Parley too. If you're getting a lot of value out of the things that I make, then maybe that's you. And for a lot of people, that will not be you. It doesn't have to be worth $5 to you. It's okay to enjoy it for free if that's the situation you're in. I just want you to think about whether that's you or not. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you had fun. I'm looking forward to the next one. I think I'll read the prompt by me for the next month at the end of these. That seems like a useful thing to do, right? So I always make these, a week or two after the month is over. So this was the prompt from October. And that means that I've written the prompt for November already. So what you can respond to right now, I'll read that to you now. And then if you have Crew Parley, maybe that'll inspire you to, you'll want to go weigh in. So here it is. My November 2024 prompt for Crew Parley is, hit me with your biggest quotes, phrases, sayings, and stuff like that. They don't have to be famous quotes or whatever. I don't care who said them. It might very well just be something you think is useful. And I won't hold it against you if it doesn't apply universally or something. These don't need to be the building blocks of reality, just interesting, useful maxim type of things. Let's say 2 or 3 with a little explanation, or just 1 if you have a lot of explanation. Kind of like what Mr. Foot, when you said, I do have a mindset that applies here. Sure, like thought tools, I often call them. If you have stuff like that. And it was, of course, inspired, Mr. Food, by you saying that. So looking forward to it, folks. I tried to do one that was a little bit simpler so that more people could respond quickly if they wanted to, while still making it a deep question, like, why do you think that's a good quote, for people that want to respond at length, because I love the long responses too. Like, obviously, that's just great. We got a lot out of them. So looking forward to it. I hope you'll participate if you'd like to. And if you support me at this $5 tier, just thank you. I really appreciate that. That's why I'm able to do this for a living. So thanks. See you in the next one.